on a fog-covered stretch of the Oregon coast. An aging fisherman named Ethan Miles discovered a mysterious coffin washed ashore near a remote island. No name, no shipwreck nearby, just a barnacle-covered box the sea had chosen to return. What he found inside wasn't a body, but a treasure, and a story lost to time. This emotional, true story of how one fisherman found a coffin washed ashore and uncovered a century-old mystery will stay with you long after the final wave. But before we dive in, tell us, where are you watching from? We love seeing our global family in the comments. Let's get started. The cold wind off the Oregon coast always carried a hint of salt and sorrow. Each morning, it brushed over the craggy shoreline like the hand of something ancient, whispering stories only the sea remembered. Ethan Miles, a grizzled fisherman in his early 60s, stood alone at the helm of his aging boat, the Albatross. He'd fished these waters his entire life, hauling crab pots, fixing torn nets, and listening to the gulls cry above the gray horizon. Since his wife Charlotte had passed 3 winters ago, the ocean had become his only companion. Not a day passed that he didn't wake before dawn, sip coffee from a rusted thermos, and set out into the vast unknown, chasing routine more than fish. On this morning, after a violent storm had pounded the coast through the night, the sea felt different. Still. Too still. The sky above was a dull silver, and the waves moved like they were heavy with secrets. Ethan guided the Albatross through the mist, unaware that what he was about to find, wedged between 2 rocks off the edge of an uninhabited island, would shatter the silence of history itself. At first, Ethan thought it was driftwood, another casualty of the storm. But as the Albatross crept closer to the jagged rocks surrounding Greystone Island, something about the shape caught his eye. It wasn't the rough shape of a crate or broken mast. No, this thing had lines long, rectangular. A box. A large one, about 6 feet long. Its edges were rounded with age, crusted over with barnacles, half buried in sand, as if the sea had tried to hide it, and then, for some reason, changed its mind. Ethan's brow furrowed, his hand tightening on the throttle. A cold wind whispered across his neck, and for a moment, he hesitated. The engine hummed beneath his boots, steady but quiet, as if waiting. He killed the motor and let the boat drift. The world fell eerily still. No birds, no breeze, just the creak of wood and the soft slap of waves. He stared at the object, uneasy. It looked like a coffin, and that word stuck in his mind like a splinter. He reached for the radio. "Coastal Watch, this is Albatross 7. Do you copy?" he said, voice steadier than he felt. A burst of static crackled before a calm voice replied. "Go ahead, Albatross 7. I've found something," Ethan said slowly, choosing his words. "Large wooden box. Looks old. About 6 feet long. Beached near Greystone Island. Might be a coffin." There was a pause. Then, "Can you maintain distance? A patrol boat will investigate." He agreed. Of course. But as he sat there, bobbing gently in the swell, every instinct in him prickled. Greystone Island wasn't on many maps. Locals didn't talk about it, too rocky to build on. No paths, no homes, just a spit of land wrapped in fog and mystery. He'd heard stories. Everyone had. Shipwrecks, ghost lights, a lighthouse keeper who vanished back in 1921, leaving nothing but his boots on the rocks. But Ethan didn't believe in legends. Until now. He stared at the box again. Was it really a coffin? Was someone buried at sea and the tide had brought them back? Or was it something else? A chest from a sunken galleon. A relic. His mind wandered through the old tales he'd heard in coastal taverns as a boy cursed treasure, drowned sailors who never rested, coffins filled not with bodies, but with secrets. He waited. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Still no sign of the patrol. The silence settled heavier than before. Even the gulls stayed away. Ethan thought of Charlotte, how she used to tell him that loneliness makes men do foolish things. But she also believed in signs, in fate. He untied the small rowboat he always kept at the side of the Albatross, lowered it into the water, and climbed in with practiced ease. The oars dipped silently into the sea, and he rowed toward the shore, heart pounding. The beach was slick with seaweed and storm-tossed debris. His boots squelched into the wet sand as he stepped out. The object now fully visible was even more unsettling up close. The wood was dark, worn smooth by decades, maybe centuries beneath the sea. Iron bands wrapped around it, rusted and half-eaten by salt. Barnacles clung to every crevice. A thin line of carvings ran along the edge, almost imperceptible, worn by time. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just some floating debris. It was handcrafted. And old. He knelt beside it, reaching out with one calloused hand. The surface was rough and cold beneath his fingers. He scraped gently, revealing curved lines, perhaps initials or a family crest. Too faint to read clearly. He should have waited. He knew that. But something deeper, a voice inside, urged him. Look. Just a look. He found a piece of driftwood nearby and wedged it into the split in the lid. Slowly, gently. He pried. The wood creaked, moaned even, but held. Then a faint crack. The lid shifted slightly. He froze. The air around him felt colder. Was he disturbing something that should have stayed hidden? He thought of turning back. Then the sun broke through the clouds for the first time all morning, casting a pale beam across the object. And in that light, near the top, he saw something that made his heart stop. 2 letters, intertwined and barely visible under the grime. A&C? He whispered to himself. Charlotte. No, that wasn't possible. But it was enough. He pushed harder. The lid gave another inch. Dust puffed up like ash. A strange scent drifted out, old metal, damp wood, and something else. Not rot. Something ancient. And then he saw it. Not bones, not cloth, but glinting light. Gold. Coins. Dozens of them. Some spilled out, their edges catching the sun. And beneath them, a silver goblet, a jeweled ring, and an ornate pendant with the faint profile of a woman. His breath hitched. It wasn't a coffin at all. Or maybe it had been. But someone had buried more than a body here. Ethan staggered back, heart thundering. It was a treasure chest, disguised to look like a coffin. Or a coffin that held treasure, because someone couldn't bear to bury a loved one without their riches. He looked around, still alone. His mind swirled with questions. Who was this woman? Why here? Why now? The pendant's portrait, though faded, showed a woman in Victorian dress. Her eyes hauntingly calm. Something inside Ethan cracked. He thought of Charlotte again, her smile, her voice. Maybe he hadn't found treasure. Maybe he'd found a story. One that was waiting, begging to be told. Ethan stood frozen, the wind brushing against his weathered face, carrying the scent of old wood, salt, and something heavier like time itself had exhaled. He wanted to turn away. He should have turned away. But the pendant glinted again in the shifting light, and something about the woman's face pulled at him. Her expression wasn't joyful, nor mournful. It was knowing, as if she understood she'd waited long enough. He knelt slowly, brushing the gold coins aside with gentle hands. Some stuck together, green from corrosion, others still gleamed as if untouched by years. Underneath, nestled in the silt and decay, he found more: a silver comb with pearl inlays, a tiny hand mirror with a cracked glass, and at the very bottom, wrapped in what remained of velvet, was a small, leather-bound journal. His fingers trembled as he lifted it out. The cover flaked under his touch, and the spine was brittle with age. He opened it carefully, page by page. Most of the ink was faded, washed by time and water. But one name repeated again and again in elegant cursive: Annabel Carraway. Annabel? So that was her. The initials on the lid, A and C. The woman in the pendant. He sat back on his heels, the sea hissing nearby. The sound no longer felt like waves. It felt like whispers. He turned the journal over in his hands. On the last page, somehow less damaged than the rest, a final sentence curled across the paper. "May the sea carry me home, if no one else will." Ethan's throat tightened. He looked up, eyes scanning the horizon for the patrol boat. Still nothing. Just a vast emptiness, like the world had paused for this moment. He stared down at the opened chest again and felt an ache bloom in his chest. Not greed, not fear, but grief. Someone had loved this woman. Someone had sent her into the sea not to be forgotten, but to be remembered someday. And now, the sea had returned her. A gull cried in the distance, finally breaking the silence, and the spell seemed to shift. Ethan carefully closed the lid. It no longer looked like treasure. It looked like a tomb, sacred, heavy with memory. He sat beside it for a while, staring out at the ocean. He thought of Charlotte, how she had always believed that some people are chosen by the sea, that the water takes and gives in its own time. He whispered aloud, "Why me?" No one answered, but the air felt different, charged. That's when he heard it, the low hum of an engine. He turned sharply. On the horizon, a speck grew steadily larger, a patrol boat, cutting across the waves. Relief washed over him, quickly followed by panic. He'd already opened it. He'd already seen everything. His hand still bore the dust of history. Ethan stood, brushing the sand off his jeans. His legs felt stiff, like he'd been sitting for hours. He looked at the chest, now partially covered in seaweed and driftwood again. He thought for a moment, then gently pulled the lid shut. It no longer fit quite right, but it was close enough. He backed away slowly. By the time the boat arrived and anchored offshore, Ethan was already back on the sand near his dinghy. Two officers stepped off, one older, one young and eager-looking. The older one approached first, nodding politely. "Mr. Miles, you're the one who made the call." "Yes," Ethan said quietly. "It's just over there, by the rocks." The younger officer, Officer Nolan, walked ahead, boots splashing in the shallows. He let out a low whistle as he approached the box. "Looks like a coffin," he called out. The older officer squinted. "Might be. Barnacle-covered. Let's document it and call it in for pickup." Ethan watched them work. The younger officer pulled out his phone to take photos. The older man took notes. They examined the carvings, the rusted iron bands, the overall shape. But they didn't open it, and Ethan didn't tell them that he already had. He stood silent, hands deep in his jacket pockets. His heart still thudded, but the fear had faded. In its place was something else: responsibility. He didn't want to lie, but he also didn't want to cheapen what he had seen, what he felt. Some things weren't meant to be turned into headlines. "Did you touch it?" the older officer asked, glancing back at him. Ethan nodded slowly. "I got close. Didn't open it. Figured I'd wait for you. The lie stung, but it came out soft, wrapped in the kind of voice old fishermen use when the sea has already taken more than it gave. The officers didn't press further. They decided to lift the box onto their vessel and bring it to the Historical Research Center in Newport. Ethan watched them struggle with the weight. It was heavier than it looked. The metal hinges shrieked softly as they carried it. He couldn't help but wonder if the chest remembered him. Before they left, Officer Nolan looked back. "Thanks for calling it in. A lot of folks would have just walked away." Ethan smiled faintly. Didn't feel right to... When they were gone, and the sound of the engine faded, the silence returned. But this time, it wasn't empty. It was full of stories, of questions, of a woman named Annabelle Carraway. That night, Ethan sat by his fireplace, staring into the flames. The journal lay beside him, wrapped in cloth, still damp and fragile. He hadn't told them about it. Somehow, it felt like it wasn't for them. It was for him. He opened it again, slowly, reading the fading lines. Most of it was poetry, sorrowful, longing and notes to someone named Thomas. Maybe a husband, maybe a brother. But one line stood out. "If you find me, know that I was never lost. I have always been with the sea." Ethan leaned back in his chair, blinking away the tears that had come without warning. He wasn't a scholar. He wasn't a man of great knowledge. But he understood grief, and he understood love. And now, he understood what it meant to carry a story not meant for the world, but for the heart. Days passed, but the weight of that morning on Greystone Island refused to lift. Ethan returned to the water, like he always had, boots heavy on the deck, hands numb with cold, steering the albatross into the early mist. But something had shifted. He no longer looked at the sea as just water. It now felt like a memory made liquid, alive, watching, remembering. Every time he passed near the island, his eyes drifted toward the shoreline, where the sand still held the shape of that coffin-shaped box. Though it was gone now, taken inland by researchers and officials, Ethan could still feel its presence, as if the island itself remembered. And then there were the dreams, night after night. Ethan would wake to the sound of waves that weren't there. He'd see a woman standing at the edge of the surf in his mind, her long dress fluttering in the wind. Her face turned toward him. Not frightening, not accusing, just waiting, like she'd been waiting a very long time. The pendant never left his thoughts, nor did her name Annabelle Carraway. One afternoon, nearly a week after the discovery, Ethan received a call from the Newport Historical Research Center. A soft-spoken woman introduced herself as Dr. Amelia Langford. She thanked him for reporting the find and invited him to visit the facility. "We'd like you to see what we've uncovered," she said. "You're part of this now." He wasn't sure what made him agree. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe he just needed to know. That Friday, he made the 2-hour drive down the winding coastal roads, passing sleepy harbors and wind-worn lighthouses. The research center was quiet, tucked beside an old wharf, its halls lined with relics of storms and stories long forgotten. Dr. Langford met him in the foyer. She was in her 40s, warm-eyed, with wind-blown curls and the kind of voice that belonged to libraries and lullabies. She led him through the exhibits and into a private room at the back, where a long oak table stretched beneath soft museum lights. Ethan stopped. There it was. The chest. Cleaned now, its wood dark and polished, the carvings more visible. The letters A and C shimmered faintly under the glass. Around it lay the contents coins, jewelry, the comb, the mirror, the silver goblet, and at the very center, the pendant. "Doctor," Langford gestured for him to step closer. "We believe the chest belonged to a young woman named Annabelle Carraway. Based on maritime logs, there was a private vessel called the Rosemore that vanished off the coast of Oregon in 1863. It carried a handful of passengers returning from London to San Francisco, among them a Miss Carraway and her father, Thomas." Ethan's eyes stayed locked on the pendant. "She died at sea." Langford nodded. "From the journal you found, and thank you again for preserving it, it seems her father had the chest constructed to hold both her body and her belongings. He wanted her to be remembered. He likely intended to return her home. But the ship never made it." Ethan said nothing. His throat was tight again. "She wrote often of the sea," Langford continued. "She believed it was a living thing, that it kept stories until someone was ready to listen. Strange, isn't it?" He finally spoke, voice hoarse. "Not strange at all." She gave him a curious look, but didn't press. Instead, she placed something small in his palm, a white glove, and then the pendant. "I thought you might want a closer look," she said softly. Ethan held it carefully, running a thumb over the edge. The portrait inside was clearer now. A young woman, delicate features, eyes that seemed to hold both sorrow and grace. It made his chest ache. "Do you believe," he said slowly, "that we find things because we're meant to?" Dr. Langford was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled. "Some of us are fishermen, Mr. Miles. Others are just looking for what the sea wants to be remembered." He didn't stay long, just enough to thank her and return the pendant gently to its case. But that night, back in his small home above the harbor, he sat in silence by the fire. He didn't eat, didn't sleep, just listened to the ocean beyond his window and stared into the glow of the flames. And finally, he understood. This wasn't about gold or historical artifacts. It was about a voice that had waited over 100 years to be heard, and he had been the one to hear it. He thought of Charlotte again, of her belief in signs. She used to say that sometimes, when people are grieving. They're closer to the stories of the past because grief is like water. It finds every crack in the soul. Maybe the sea had chosen him not just because he was there, but because he was ready. Ready to remember. Ready to carry someone else's sorrow alongside his own. He walked to his bookshelf, pulled out a blank journal, and opened to the first page. He wrote, "Her name was Annabelle Carraway. The sea kept her. And then, it gave her back. Not for treasure, but for truth." Then he set down the pen, leaned back, and closed his eyes. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't dream of loss. He dreamed of the sea not angry or cold, but calm. And waiting, in the weeks that followed, Ethan Miles tried to return to his old life. He still rose before the sun, still launched the albatross into the morning mist, still checked his traps and read the tides. But everything felt different. The silence of the sea, once a comfort, now carried weight, as if the water itself had grown heavy with memory. He avoided attention as best he could, but word had gotten out. The newspapers called it the Greystone Discovery. They printed photos of the chest, the pendant, the jewelry. Some called it one of the most significant maritime finds on the Pacific coast in decades. Others speculated about the coins, wondering how much they were worth. But Ethan didn't care for the headlines. He'd seen what was inside, and it had nothing to do with gold. It was a life, a story, a grief that had crossed oceans to be remembered. He found himself thinking about that journal constantly, the words Annabelle had written in delicate, sloping script. Her thoughts weren't those of a woman afraid of death. They were the reflections of someone who had made peace with her fate. Someone who believed the ocean was more than just water. One line in particular stayed with him. "If you find me, may you carry not my riches but my memory." He hadn't told anyone about that page, not even Dr. Langford, because deep down, Ethan knew this wasn't meant for a museum. It was meant for him. He sat with that thought for days. Let it roll around inside his mind like a tide smoothing out a jagged stone. And slowly, a new feeling began to rise in his chest, one he hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. Not obligation. Not routine. But a pull, like a compass finding north. One rainy afternoon, he stood outside an old, weather-beaten lighthouse just north of the harbor. It had been decommissioned years ago, left to crumble on the edge of the cliffs. The paint had peeled, the roof had caved in, and the metal lantern housing sat rusted like a skeleton of its former self. But Ethan didn't see decay. He saw a possibility. He saw her. He saw meaning. The town council thought he was crazy at first. What would an aging fisherman want with a ruined lighthouse? But when he offered to buy it with a portion of the reward he'd received for the discovery, no one argued. They sold it to him for less than the value of a used truck. What they didn't understand was this: Ethan wasn't trying to rebuild a lighthouse. He was trying to build a home for memory. He called it Caraway Haven. He worked on it himself at first, hammer in hand, rain in his face. He tore out rotted boards, cleared out nests and debris, painted the stone walls with slow, deliberate strokes. Eventually, others offered to help: neighbors, old friends, even strangers who'd read about the chest in the paper. Some brought tools, some brought stories, some just showed up to shake his hand and say thank you. Because something about the story, about Annabelle, had touched them too. And that was the miracle of it. It wasn't just a box of treasure anymore. It was connection. It was healing. By late spring, the lighthouse stood tall again. Not polished, not pristine, but whole, clean, humble, beautiful. Inside, Ethan built a small library with shelves filled with maritime journals, local legends, and sea stories told over generations. On one wall, he placed a photograph of the pendant. Beneath it, a plaque that read, "For those lost to the sea and those found by it." The top floor was restored with a new lens, a fresh beacon, not for navigation, but for remembrance. And every night, just before sunset, Ethan would climb the spiral stairs to light it himself. It became a ritual, a quiet promise to someone he had never known, but now couldn't forget. Reporters came. They asked questions. They took photos. They tried to get a quote for the magazines. Ethan gave them all the same answer. "I didn't find treasure," he said. "I found a reason to begin again." Caraway Haven opened its doors that summer not as a museum, but as a place for fishermen to rest when storms rolled in. A safe space to tell stories, to remember the ones who never made it back to shore. It wasn't fancy, but it was real. And it was hers. Every now and then, Ethan would return to Greystone Island. He'd anchor the Albatross a few hundred feet from the shore, sit quietly in the rocking boat, and just watch. He never spoke aloud, but he always felt something. Someone with him. The sea had always taken. Now, for the first time, it had given something back. And Ethan Miles, lonely, grieving, half-forgotten Ethan had taken that gift and turned it into light. Not for fame, not for gold, but because some stories deserve to be seen, even after 150 years. Especially then. The lighthouse changed everything. Not just the view from Ethan's window, or the way the sea breeze carried salt through its open halls. It changed him. For the first time in years, Ethan had a reason to wake up that wasn't bound to tide charts or lobster pots. His hands, once worn from routine, were now busy with care-sanding wood, restoring beams, polishing brass until the lantern room shone like fire above the cliffs. But the work wasn't what kept him going. It was the people. The first to visit Caraway Haven were local fishermen. Some were old friends, others were strangers, drawn by whispers of the man who found the coffin by the sea. They'd come up the spiral staircase and stand silently beneath the beacon, staring out into the waves as if searching for someone long gone. They never stayed long, but before they left, they always told Ethan a story about a brother who never came back, a ship that vanished in fog, a father who left and never returned. Grief, folded carefully in calloused voices. And Ethan listened. He listened like someone who finally understood that silence could be shared. One morning in late autumn, a boy arrived. No older than 12, with wild red hair and a jacket far too big for his frame. He stood awkwardly at the lighthouse door, holding something wrapped in canvas. Ethan opened the door with a cautious smile. "You lost." The boy shook his head. "My grandma said you'd know what to do with this." He held out the bundle. Ethan gently unwrapped it, revealing a framed photograph, faded and cracked down the middle. A man in a Navy uniform stood proudly on the deck of a ship, his hand resting on a boy's shoulder. The name scrawled on the back, Benjamin Rhodes, 1944. "That's my great-grandpa," the boy said. "Went missing in a storm. They never found his ship." Ethan nodded, his throat tight. "Would you like him to stay here?" The boy nodded. She said maybe he'd feel less lost. So Ethan placed the photo in a small alcove beneath the stairs, beside a lantern and a single white stone. He lit the lantern that night and left it glowing until sunrise. From then on, more mementos came. Old letters, a rusted compass, a captain's hat wrapped in oilcloth. Each object carried someone's sorrow, and Ethan gave each a place. Not on a pedestal, just a shelf, a window, a quiet corner. A shrine for the forgotten. But something else changed, too. He started dreaming of her again. Annabelle. Some nights, she stood on the beach, waves touching her feet. Other times, she stood beneath the lighthouse, the wind combing through her dark hair. Her eyes always found his, calm and knowing. He never heard her voice, but he always felt it. And that feeling began to unravel something inside him. For years, Ethan had believed his heart had died with Charlotte. That grief was a room he'd locked from the inside, too afraid to touch the memories that lived there. But Annabelle changed that. Not because she was young, or tragic, or beautiful, but because her story, her quiet, forgotten life had reminded him that love doesn't end with death. It waits. It endures. It calls. And one night, as he sat by the fire in the lighthouse kitchen, flipping through the pages of her water-warped journal, he found a line he hadn't noticed before. "If you ever feel alone, know this. You are part of a story that began long before you and will echo long after you're gone." He read that sentence over and over again. And he cried. Not the silent, exhausted kind of tears he'd shed in the years after Charlotte passed. These were different. These were thank you tears. I remember you tears. Tears that didn't ache. They healed. Later that winter, Dr. Langford returned to Caraway Haven, bringing news from the university archives. "We found something," she told Ethan quietly. "A letter from Annabelle's father to her mother, dated a month before the ship went down." She handed him a photocopy. The ink had faded, but the words still breathed with love. "My dearest Margaret, our Annabelle grows weaker. The doctors say the sea air may ease her lungs. She does not fear what lies ahead. She says the sea is calling her, that she feels safe in its arms. If we don't make it to you, please know I have given her back to the sea gently, with music with prayer, with love. Ethan folded the letter slowly, pressing it to his chest. All this time, he had thought he found her by accident, but now he realized. She had been sent. A final act of love? A father refusing to let his daughter disappear alone. And somehow, by fate, or storm, or the tides, Ethan had been the one to bring her home. That spring, the town honored Ethan with a ceremony. He didn't want one. He didn't believe in speeches or medals, but they insisted. So he stood quietly by the lighthouse, in a suit that didn't quite fit, surrounded by people who had come not to see a hero, but to witness the story that had touched them all. When it was his turn to speak, he stepped up to the microphone, cleared his throat, and said, "I once thought the sea only took things from me. Now I know it was holding on to something until I was ready to receive it. Grief doesn't end, but neither does love." And when he finished, the crowd didn't clap. They just stood still, many with tears in their eyes. Because they understood, and that's all Ethan ever wanted. To be understood. To know that the story he had carried alone was now carried by others. Not for glory, not for treasure, but because some stories like Annabelle's deserve to be felt. Forever. Years passed. Caraway Haven became more than a lighthouse. It became a place where grief found a resting place, and silence could speak. People came from towns scattered up and down the coast, sometimes in groups, sometimes alone. They brought nothing but memories, and they left behind small offerings, a name scrawled on a piece of driftwood, a faded photo, a shell from a beach where someone once laughed. Ethan never turned anyone away. He greeted them with a nod, a steady hand, and the kind of silence that said, "You don't have to explain. I already understand." He rarely spoke of Annabelle anymore, not because he forgot, but because her story had taken root in the very stones of the place. It didn't need to be told. It was felt. In the hush of the lantern room, in the low creak of the old wood floors, in the way the sea seemed gentler at the base of the cliffs. But Ethan still carried her with him. Every morning, he climbed the spiral stairs to the lantern room. His knees ached now. His breath came slower. But he climbed anyway because there was light to keep. And in his pocket, always, was a small token, a photograph of Charlotte, folded beside a pressed page from Annabelle's journal. Two women, decades apart, bound by one man's heart. One morning, just as the horizon broke open with golden light, Ethan paused at the top step and leaned against the iron railing. The sea stretched endlessly before him, calm and silver, like glass. It was then he knew. He was ready, not to let go but to pass the light on. That afternoon, he called Dr. Langford. She came 2 days later, smiling the moment she saw him standing at the lighthouse door with a small leather-bound journal in his hand. "You're giving it to the museum?" she asked gently. "No," he said, voice quiet. "I'm giving it to you, because I trust you to tell it right." She nodded, understanding. Together they walked the halls of Caraway Haven, now filled with decades of offerings and memories. At the heart of it all, beneath the lighthouse's great beam, was a display case newly built, empty. Ethan opened the journal, turned to the first page, and laid it gently inside. Dr. Langford sealed the glass. Beneath it, a plaque read, "This is not a story about treasure. It is a story about remembering. Found by Ethan Miles. Given back to the light by the sea." The opening ceremony was small, just a handful of people, a few reporters, and those who'd left their hearts in the walls of Caraway Haven. Ethan stood off to the side, wearing his old coat, hands clasped behind his back. He didn't need to speak. The story had already been told in whispers, in waves, in every soul who had walked through the lighthouse doors and left lighter. That night, as the guests left, and the stars blinked into the sky, Ethan stood alone beneath the sweeping lantern beam. The wind curled around him like a farewell. And for the first time since Charlotte passed, he didn't feel alone. He felt home. He looked out to sea and whispered softly, "She's home now." He wasn't talking about Annabelle. He wasn't even talking about Charlotte. He was talking about himself. That night, he lit the beacon one last time. The golden light swept across the waves, touching the water like a hand, reaching out. The sea shimmered in response, and Ethan could have sworn he heard music on the wind faint, far off, like the sound of a piano playing underwater. He closed his eyes, let the wind move through his hair, and smiled. In the days that followed, Ethan's chair in the lantern room sat empty. Visitors still came. They asked where he'd gone. Some thought he moved inland. Others believed he'd simply vanished, like the sea had called him home. "Doctor," Langford found a letter taped to the inside of the lighthouse's front door. It was written in Ethan's careful hand. "If you're reading this, I've gone where the waves never stop. Don't grieve. I didn't leave behind a legacy. I left behind a light. Keep it burning. For those who are lost, for those who wait to be found, for those, like me, who needed one last story to feel whole again." And at the bottom, a line scribbled in different ink. "The sea keeps what we forget until it's time to remember. Doctor," Langford read the letter aloud to the staff, then quietly placed it beside the journal. That night, the lighthouse shone brighter than ever. No one knew why. Some say the beam reached farther, others say it pulsed like a heartbeat. But those who stood at the cliffs and watched swear they saw two figures at the water's edge, a man in a fisherman's coat and a woman in white, walking side by side, fading into the mist. Years later, Caraway Haven remains. The wood has aged, the stones have settled, but the light still shines. People still come, not for treasure, but for peace, for memory, for a place where grief is honored and stories are held with tenderness. And beneath the beacon, a brass plaque now reads, "In honor of Ethan Miles, who listened to the sea and found the soul within it." And if you visit on a still night, when the wind carries just right, you might hear a whisper in the waves, not in words, but in feeling, a quiet knowing that love, real love, never truly dies. It waits, and sometimes it returns, carried gently by the sea. Sometimes, life doesn't give us answers, it gives us stories. Ethan Miles didn't set out to find meaning. He wasn't chasing a mystery or hoping for treasure. He was just a grieving man trying to survive the quiet. But when the sea returned something long forgotten, a coffin filled with sorrow and memory, it offered him more than gold. Ethan's journey reminds us that healing doesn't always come from closure. Sometimes, it comes from connection, from letting someone else's story open our own heart. The fisherman who once sailed alone had become the keeper of memory, the builder of light, the one who gave the lost a place to come home. Because for Ethan, and for anyone who has ever carried grief in silence, the ocean was never the end. It was always the way through. The end. Up next, 2 more stories that prove healing can come from the most unexpected places. Click to keep the light burning and hit subscribe if you believe some stories are worth remembering forever.